Can I welcome everybody to the afternoon session? I'm Richard Collier of the Centre for Business Tax, and following our sessions this morning on the state of play and country perspectives, we're now going to turn to an evaluation of the current proposals. We'll hear first from Mike Devereux, the Director of the Centre for Business Tax, and then in place of Robert Danon, who cannot make it to the conference, I'll be speaking on some aspects of this topic. I'll be followed by Ali Kennedy, who's VP of Sophos, and then Will Morris, the Deputy Global Tax Policy Leader of PwC and representing BIAC, will come last. So, Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I should just say, discussions and questions from the floor are all part of this conference, so please do come back at the end of each session. So this is billed as a kind of economic perspective. I just want to kind of talk about some of the economic issues which arise when we're thinking about taxing the digital economy. And I would like to start with trying to identify what the problem is, which is something we actually discussed this morning. And this is the question I raised this morning, so I'm just going to pose it again. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but is the problem, the political problem really, that we don't think digital companies pay tax anywhere, or is it the political problem that is that they don't pay tax in the EU? I think that seems like actually quite a big distinction. We got quite a sensible answer from the OECD this morning, but I think there's still an issue here. We're going from possible double non-taxation to possible double taxation if we are trying to tax in more than one place. I suppose, for the sake of argument, I think my money is probably more on the latter than the former. There's money out there, and why don't we try and collect some of it? And just to try and irritate Tim Power a little bit, I thought we could have a popular name for the digital services tax as well. And we didn't really like the name Google tax, apparently. But I thought we could call it the Sutton tax, after Willie Sutton. I'm sure you all know the story of Willie Sutton, the American bank robber, who, when asked why does he rob banks, because he said that's where the money is. So I think that seems quite appropriate in this setting, actually. So, okay, that's certainly kind of one issue. Another, what's the problem? I think, the kind of more formal economic argument, and the one that's been presented by the Commission, is actually the fact that different companies are paying different levels of tax, and some maybe not paying any tax at all, could be distorting competition. It's that you could think of that as an unfairness issue. Actually, I think it was more in terms of an economic efficiency issue. If one company is getting a competitive advantage over another just because of the tax system, then that can distort competition between the two. And that's certainly true. That's certainly an issue. I think my main response to that would be that's very common. And that's kind of basically true because of the way that the international tax system works, that we have source-based taxation. So, we could think of almost any example of, suppose you've got a UK shoe manufacturer and an Italian shoe manufacturer, and they both export their shoes to Paris, and they compete in the same shop side by side. One is paying the UK rate of tax, one is paying the Italian rate of tax, and that may cause a competitive distortion. If one tax rate is lower than the other, that's going to create some kind of competitive distortion. So the idea that there's a competitive distortion is certainly not new. And it's certainly something which effectively exists because of the existing system. So, whether that's, and it might be something we want to address, but it's not clear to me it's something we should address, specifically in the digital setting. So, take this a stage further and say, why should digital companies pay more tax in, say, the UK? So if we're in the UK government has advocated that we should do this. And its argument is because they create value in the UK. And this kind of reminds me of another story. If you remember the film Casablanca, and there's a bit in the film Casablanca where the nasty Germans tell the chief of police that he has to close down Rick's Cafe, and he can't think of a good reason for closing down Rick's Cafe. So actually he says, I'm shocked to find out that there's gambling going on while he's being handed his winnings by the croupier. And this seems a little bit like this. The Treasury seem to have just realised there's value being created in the UK and we're not taxing it. So that seems to be, and there's urgency about that now because we need an interim solution as well as a long-term solution. So I want to come back to the idea of creating value. I would offer another suggestion of why we might want to tax these companies in the UK, and that's because we can. At least, possibly we can. It could be quite hard, but there is something here which is immobile. So I think, the nature of international taxes, things move about in relation to international taxes because taxes differ across countries. If we really want to have an efficient tax system, we have to try and find a tax base which is not going to move about between countries. Something which seems unlikely to move about between countries that are users of digital services. So I'm not going to emigrate because I'm using Google's search engine, and Google might be taxed because I'm using it. I can think of other reasons for emigrating, but that's probably not one of them. That effectively gives the UK an opportunity to say, you have services provided in the UK, and that makes them taxable. Of course, that's the kind of basic argument of having a destination-based tax or a tax in the market country, much more generally than in the digital context. And in the digital context is actually slightly more complicated because actually in the user in this case may not be the same as the person who's actually paying money to the provider of the service, especially in the cases like Google and Facebook. But it's pretty clear the UK's position is the former rather than the latter. So its statement in March 2018 was pretty clear on this. These are the first two sentences in the Treasury's position paper. The international tax framework is based on the principle that profits of a business should be taxed in the countries in which it creates value, and the UK continues to support that position. I think that's pretty clear. So we don't need to debate any longer whether they hold that view or not. That seems to be pretty clear. What I'd like to ask is a number of questions around that, starting from, is it really based on value creation? And I would suggest that actually at least some parts of the international tax system have very little to do with value creation. In fact, the notion of value creation seemed to come out primarily of the BEPS project. For some good reasons. I think the kind of basic idea was, we don't want to kind of agree that profits are made in tax havens where there's no economic activity taking place. So a way of identifying such tax havens is to say that there's no value being created there. And that kind of makes sense. I think there's a problem if we then take that idea and impose it on everything else that we think about the international tax system. So here's, some very brief examples of, why I think it's not entirely based on value creation. The first is, the very first lesson you're going to get in economics 101, we draw a supply curve and a demand curve. And the price at which things get transacted is where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. So it depends on cost, and the supply curve, it also depends on demand. So, suppose there's a change in demand in the market country that pushes the price up. That creates more value for the supplier. And if we're really taking the value creation seriously, then perhaps we should be allocating some of that to that market country where there's been a change in demand. Okay, we could go back and say, well, by value creation, we don't mean anything to do with demand. We're just going to take the price as given. And even in that context, we can think of cases where it doesn't really appear to be based on value creation, such as, we tax interest where it's received rather than where it's paid. And if you're going to say that lending is the source of value creation, then that doesn't really seem to be related to that either. I would argue the allocation of a risk to a risk controller has got little to do with value creation either. I thought maybe a bit more controversial, but I'm actually a bit confused about what the controller of risk is actually supposed to be doing, in fact. If you think of a kind of large multinational company, there's all kinds of risks which it faces. Maybe people don't want to buy its products anymore. Maybe the oil price goes up or down. Maybe the unions go on strike. And there's this guy who we're going to move to the Cayman Islands and say, right, just sort all that out, please. In which case, there's probably, you should be paying him a lot more money if he can do that. So I'm not entirely convinced on whether the existing system is based on value creation. I'm also not entirely convinced that it should be based on value creation. I think we could go back and ask what the fundamental principles of the tax system are and whether this is a reasonable way forward. Normally we'd start with is it based on ability to pay? Is it based on the benefit principle? this may be related to benefit principle, but only somewhat tangentially, I would say. If we go back to the UK Treasury document, it really kind of gets into quite some detail about the nature of value creation in different digital businesses, and it begins to hint that actually the way forward is to actually identify how much value is created, for example, in each of these three things. So there's we could do a Google search that provides some information for Google. You could be active on eBay. That's kind of creating network effects that may be drawing some other people into the network because there's kind of supply and demand within eBay. Or you could actually be on Facebook and contributing, writing on your page, uploading photos, uploading text, which is deliberately created to try and attract more users to that place. All of those may be different. I accept that. Whether that's a sensible basis for should we go back to this to try and think out how we're going to tax digital companies? That seems to me that it's going to be extraordinarily complicated to try and do that. Okay, and then we come to prosumers, which is the kind of word of the morning. So I think, we talked about it quite a little bit this morning. I presume that kind of prosumers is some kind of mix of producers and consumers. So that's my take on it anyway. So what's special about a prosumer as opposed to a consumer or a producer? Because I think I'm pretty sure if we asked Tim or probably many of the other speakers, do we want to tax in the place of destination because that's where the consumer is? They would say, no, that's not the basis of our proposals. So the fact that the producer may be the same person as the consumer seems to me to be kind of more or less irrelevant here. It seems to me the point of all the examples is that there's a producer here, there's somebody creating value, and can we tax it? That's very much a kind of producer-led kind of activity. So let's accept that. So digital businesses receive some value from their users, and let's accept the key issue seems to be they don't really pay for it. Well, they may provide a service, there's a kind of barter going on there. But it doesn't cost them very much, and they do get something back. So, does that create a nexus? Does that create something which we should think should be taxable here? And I like to think about that in a non-digital context. If I can just make this work. Nope. Let's go back again. So this was always going to be the bit that didn't work terribly well. Okay, here we go. So it's the World Cup. So there are several World Cup analogies coming up, well, there's two in particular. So this is the first one. So this is a story in the Telegraph a few days ago, which is that Nike pay their workers in Bangladesh 21 pence an hour to make the England kit, and the England kit is then sold to people in England, presumably for £160. So that's a pretty good business. So this seems to me to be actually a bit comparable to the value created by users of Facebook and Google. So somebody who's uploading photos onto their Facebook page, is maybe creating value for Facebook. Does Facebook pay for that? Well, not really. It kind of provides Facebook as a kind of service for free, but that's all. This seems to me kind of analogous to here. There are people in Bangladesh who are willing to produce these shirts for next to nothing. And then the question would be, okay, well, where do we expect the value generated from that to be taxed? And there may be a slight difference in this analogy because there may be a company in Bangladesh which is owned by Nike, and we're then talking about how Nike is taxed. There's a kind of related party issue. But we could all just imagine, for the sake of argument, that actually these people are independent third parties. How would they be taxed then? Okay, so that's... Okay, so what would we expect? So the minimum wage in the UK is £7.83, because I checked. So suppose the Nike are basically saying, shall I produce in Bangladesh, it's going to cost me 21 pence an hour, or shall I produce in the UK, it's going to cost me £7.83 an hour. So one might reasonably suppose, well, if you go to Bangladesh, you're going to create value of the difference between those two, which is £7.62. So where should that value be? Where should we assign that value to? If anything, it seems to be reasonable to assign it to Bangladesh. What would it actually do in this case? Well, we probably have to kind of figure out what's the value of the thing which is exported out of Bangladesh. And we'd have to think about arm's length pricing. We'd have to think about, okay, so we could, suppose there's an arm's length price. Suppose there's Nike have a sales force in Berlin who are selling England shirts. That's it's kind of where you get sent to from Nike if you kind of behave badly. So you're trying to sell England shirts in Berlin. How much do you think you're going to sell them for? Well, the answer is not very much. So there's going to be some arm's length price which is quite low. So that's but that could be an arm's length price out of Bangladesh. It's not clear how we're going to get too much value into Bangladesh. And presumably Nike have also paid the Football Association for the rights to kind of have their logo on this shirt and so on. So we might say, actually, the vast profit they're making is because of that. Then we have to ask who owns the rights. The basic issue here, though, is how much of the value are we actually going to be taxing in Bangladesh? If you accept my analogy that people in Bangladesh working for next to nothing to produce these shirts is a bit like people in Facebook producing pages on Facebook for next to nothing. Then if we want to tax the apparent value arising in Facebook in a comparable way to other things, we should think about how we're taxing those people the value in Bangladesh. Well, I have one more analogy of football. So this is kind of like fantasy football. This is, for those of you who have not seen the World Cup, so I'm thinking Judith here. This is Harry Kane. So the England captain and goal scorer, he's taken a penalty against Panama a few days ago. I'm only going to be able to use this analogy for like one day more because England are playing tomorrow night and we might lose. But in my fantasy football world, they beat Colombia tomorrow night and then they win the quarterfinals and the semi-finals and Harry Kane keeps scoring. And the amount of excitement in the UK keeps on going up. It's kind of reaching stratospheric levels as we prepare to play Brazil in the final in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, so my question is, where's the value created? So Nike is now able to sell its kit not for £160, but for £1,000, because there are so many people who want to buy this kit and go to the pub on the final day and watch them play Brazil. So, where's the value created? If Kane scores, the value of the England kit rises. Where's the value created? Well, I think there's an obvious answer, and that's Russia. Because he's taking a penalty. If he goes slightly one side of the post, then the value is lower. If it goes inside, the value is much higher. Okay, you could have a much more sophisticated answer and say, well, Harry Kane has been training in England for the last 20 years, and that's where he honed his skills, and therefore the value is really created in England. He's just kind of demonstrating it in Russia. I think if we go down that path, we're in a kind of real nightmare of trying to figure out where value is creation, because Oxford has been educating leaders for 800 years. So we'd like to claim most of the value created in the world actually originates here, and it's all down to human capital. So if we're going to base the taxes on value created, we better have a pretty better idea than this as to how we're going to do that. So is value creation really a solid basis for claiming taxing rights? And I'd argue, first of all, it's extremely vague. If you can answer those questions, this is just one analogy. But also, in applying it could create incredible complexity. And if we actually go back to the UK position paper and say, what we really want to do is figure out if there's more value, from using Spotify than using Google or using Facebook, then, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Even if we're going to have a separate tax on digital economy, we have to define what a digital economy is. I've been using online banking for the last 20 years, I think, so that makes my bank part of the digital economy. I can buy my groceries online. So what is it that is special about the digital economy that we actually want to tax? And also, if we are trying to tax value creation, then we're going to create more distortions as firms move around to try and avoid those taxes. Very briefly, why? Okay, that's the kind of broad issues really about kind of the ideas of kind of why we should tax digital companies on the basis of value creation. But this is really kind of what the UK is arguing. There's no specific argument saying we urgently need this because there's a problem. It's because we urgently need this because we've just realised that there's values being created here. That's effectively what the policy paper says, I think. In the EU, the European Commission has this argument about competition, but I already addressed that as well. It's hard to see how a tax on revenue of digital companies could really equalise the treatment between those digital companies and non-digital companies. But that's the claim that's being made by the European Commission, really. So just to conclude, it seems to me that kind of basing a tax on somewhat vague notions like where value is created is likely to lead to greater complexity. And do we really want to make the international tax system even more complicated by saying there's a special bit that we want to tax and we're going to call it digital, and we're going to have 1,000 pages of tax legislation explaining what we mean by digital, and then another 10,000 pages of guidance. So I think ultimately actually we need to think about the overall tax system. I'm afraid I'm definitely in the we need to fix the international tax system camp, as you might have known if you've been to one of these conferences before. And the kind of key issue seems to me that actually users of digital businesses are immobile. That actually, just like consumers for kind of most products, and that gives us some kind of opportunity for taxing those businesses. And that's kind of a way forward, at least the way in which we should be thinking about this. I don't want to go into any particular proposals here, but that seems to me like a sensible way to think about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I have a modest collection of slides, actually only 3. Let me get on to the second. Really just what I'm going to talk about briefly today is I'm going to make some quite quick comments on the current context. Then I particularly want to spend a bit of time talking about the European Commission longer term solution, that is the significant digital presence PE focus. I'm not especially wanting to pick on the European Commission, but a number of proposals are coming up with recommendations along these lines. So it is symptomatic of a wider set of suggestions, so I thought it would be useful to talk about it in the context of what it means for attribution. I'm also, along the way, I'm afraid I can't help myself, make some comments on value creation and issues arising under the European Commission proposal, and particularly practicalities of that. Now, I wasn't quite sure what Valeska would have taken us through in terms of detail this morning, so my last slide is really encapsulating some of the detail from the longer-term European Commission proposal. And I'm not going to slavishly read through the whole thing. But there are a couple of points that I did particularly want to draw attention to. Just before I get to that, though, can I just make a couple of comments about the current context that we're in? And it seems to me this is an extremely difficult set of issues in an extremely difficult context. Politics is, of course, inevitable and has come across as a fairly strong theme, but I think it's fair to say, or at least it seems to me, that it's not helping the current environment. There's quite a remarkable shift in the focus of political interest in international tax. If we go back to business restructuring, not even 10 years ago, there was the historic posture of zero political interest in international tax matters. When we got to BEPS, there was interest from a political perspective, but it was really following developments. What seems to be the shift with digital is that politics is out ahead of the issue, and that does make it arguably more difficult. I see 3 potential issues, which is 1, pressures to solve the digital within the current tax system. In other words, not open the door to wider questions about allocation of taxing rights. Secondly, I think political pressures force the timeline. I think, I'm not sure if it's John Peterson made the point this morning, but that can be a healthy pressure. Well, I do get that. But what's the case with digital is this is a very, very difficult set of issues. And above all, it's a set of issues on which we need consensus. So having a very forced timeline does seem to me not a good idea. And then finally, the other thing I think this political interest and pressure does is it obscures the issues we're dealing with. and so we see a lot about digital as a BEPS issue. I just think that's creating the wrong solutions, and it's a confusion with issues that are left over after BEPS. We've obviously got another host of difficulties, and I think some of them were this morning. I won't go through those, but the one I did want to bring your attention to was not particularly mentioned this morning, but it was very much a big issue in the OECD initial work, and that is the practical difficulties in agreeing or valuing the contribution that is actually made from data, networks, users, and so on. That's a really, really big problem. And I want to come back to that. That's why I mention it. I did wonder if I could get away with mentioning a comment on the relationship between the OECD and the European Commission, because it does seem to me that it exhibits all the traits of warm and generous cooperation as seen in two states in an arms race. But probably it's not quite fair to make that comment. Let's go back to the longer term solution. As you'll probably realise from this morning, there are basically two steps. Would be very familiar to us who deal with treaties, which is step one is we redefine the threshold test with a significant digital presence. I won't go through the requirements, you can see them written up. And then step two, we allocate income based on, essentially we're adapting the existing Article 7 to the attribution of profits to PE rule in the AOA style, the authorised OECD approach style, so we can do this. And there are a couple of other points I just did want to draw your attention to, which is, and these are all quotes or paraphrases from the European Commission report, for this purpose, activities undertaken through a digital interface which relate to data or users shall be considered economically significant activities of the significant digital presence, which attribute risks and economic ownerships of assets to such presence. And we're reminded we need to take account of economically significant activities performed by the significant digital presence, including those relevant to DEMPI functions. And DEMPI functions are those activities that particularly create a lot of reward in relation to typically the development of intangibles. So DEMPI is development, enhancement, maintenance, protection and exploitation of the underlying intangible property. So that's the idea, and then you'll see last bullet point to determine the attributable profits, use a profit split method. So that's what they say. It sounds reasonably straightforward. In terms of, like the UK Treasury proposals, these proposals in the European Commission document are absolutely founded on the notion of value creation. It's really the first substantive proposition in the paper, that this is being based on value creation and the fact that we need the significant digital presence, PE, to correct value creation problem given the core activity of data and content. In other words, we need to make companies pay taxes where they make profits. So what's happening as far as I can see is that the BEPS overhaul of transfer pricing produces some notion of value creation, so it's used as an explanation, about the acts of the enterprise. It's about the acts of the MNC. And really this came up in the discussion about what we call the delineation of the transaction. And the idea was that if we book or contractually shift profits to Cayman, when in fact we've got substantive activities of the entrepreneur in a different location, we should recognise that value creation and instead reward that, or at least not instead reward that commensurately with the value that's contributed. That's pretty conventional application of transfer pricing thinking. But we take that notion of value creation, which probably is the most successful export of BEPS, given that everybody's using it, and it seems to me, and this I take from almost everything I read, that is presented as a complete explanation of the arm's length principle. And in restating the arm's length principle in the notion of value creation, we are shifting the bounds of what activity or functions need to be rewarded. And now value creation is not about the business, it's about the value creation by third-party unconscious contributors. So there's something that's quite significant going on with value creation, which I find completely odd, I think is a polite word. I can see how value creation is a useful paraphrasing of the arm's length principle exercise in the way I explained in some cases. But it was developed in an anti-avoidance context in BEPS, in the notion of what delineation is, and it's trying to get us back to arm's length results. It seems clearly inadequate, completely inadequate, and as an explanation of the arm's length principle, and therefore I think it's misleading, and it's incredibly complex. If we want to convert all of our transfer pricing problems into value creation problems, this is going to be inordinately complex. And also, some of the biggest gaps in BEPS have absolutely nothing to do with value creation at all, as far as I'm concerned. So I think the value, I'm very, you can see, not a big fan. It's obviously a house attribute that we're not a great big fans of value creation. I think it helps dress up attempts to solve the digital issue as being apparently consistent with the arm's length principle or similar to the existing tax system when they really are not. Now, let's just make some more. I wanted to make three particular comments going back to this longer term solution. Firstly, threshold. There are various issues on threshold, but I'm going to mention just one. This is on the threshold test this is the step one. The significant digital presence mirrors the PE threshold that we're used to from treaties, but there's one big difference. The significant digital presence is not about the business of an enterprise to create the PE of an enterprise. It is simply requires a business in the single significant digital presence. Now, the wording in this proposed directive is a bit vague, so forgive me if I'm not quite getting this, but as far as I can see, what the practical effect of that means is that we're creating a group PE, not an entity PE. I understand why that's being done, but it means potentially a major job of reconciling the significant digital presence slice of the profits with the allocation of profits across the group entities so that we don't, for example, have double tax. That is enormously complex in and of itself. Actually, also, it creates an asymmetric solution given that non-member states with treaties will not be subject to this treatment. So that's a slight irony in that this is all about stopping distortion, but it's actually going to create some distortions. Second point I wanted to make is that if you look to the third bullet point on this slide, you can see that the intention is that activities through a digital interface relating to data or users must be considered economically significant activities, as it seems to me, that's what it's saying, which of the significant digital presence, which attribute risks and assets to the significant digital presence. Now that seems rather a blunt deeming rule. Are any and all activities to have this effect? Any qualitative test as a gateway? What if the actual activities are actually not economically significant? Is that even a possibility? What about other activities outside the state that would otherwise be taken account of? For example, the activities of producing or procuring the data or the users, etc. If they're ignored, how are they rewarded? I think that's not what's intended. I think that they should not be ignored, and I think that's more likely, but how are they analysed together with this rule? Now, it might be possible to find some kind of common currency, for want of a better word, by which we can assess the relative contributions of the two, but if that is the case, and given what it's said about the attribution of assets, I assume including intangible assets, then I assume we're going to have split assets, as we call them, when we do PE attribution. In other words, assets that are attributable to both to the head office and the PE. And given that we have given, if I'm right, this is a PE of group entities, we're not just going to have split assets, we're going to potentially have a much wider set of issues about how we allocate between the PE, the digital PE, and all the other group companies. And if we are attributing assets to the PE in this way, for example, intangible assets, do we then need to capitalise the PE? In the banking sector, we have endless arguments about this, including the currency of the capital. The scope for complexity is is, I wouldn't say limitless, it's getting on for being quite significant. And then the last point I wanted to make on this particular proposal is the use of profit splits. The thinking to me, and I see this in two or three other contexts recently as well, but the thinking seems to be that we do have these valuation problems with networks and data and users and so on, but they'll all go away if we use a profit split. Everything will be fine. We just put it in a profit split. And I think the idea is, well, we can just put it in a profit split, and it can be a residual to which the profits left over after rewarding other functions are taken out. But I don't think that's how profit splits work, at least not currently. The latest and I think much improved guidance on profit splits came out of the OECD about 10 days ago. It seems to me pretty clear in that we can't just have some kind of black hole relating to a digital PE contribution. Rather, it's axiomatic that profit splits must operate on an economically valid basis, approximating the profits that would be agreed at arm's length. So we can't hide from the valuation contribution assessment exercise, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk as being one of the key problems. And of course, that is going to vary from one business to another in a big way. I had various other points about the demarcation of the network intangible or the asset or the user intangible from other intangibles. I'm just not, I don't think I've got time to go into them, but the point I'm trying to make is this isn't just difficult, it is phenomenally complex, and it's passed off in the European Commission comments as though we're just going to do profit splits. There's going to be enormously complex in practice. And I just wonder how much extra tax is really going to be involved in this. With all of technical vagaries I mentioned, plus the multiple group entities, all performing different functions and services, some revenue generators, some asset owners, some support, some one or more of these things in the fast and constantly changing digital models and creeping digitalization, with variation from business sector to sector, and also within sectors between competitors, and within individual companies from period to period, etc., etc. Ascertaining the profits that are attributable to a single digital presence will be a highly complex undertaking. It'll be contentious from between states, and contentious between states and taxpayers. And the whole thing is going to be a bespoke exercise only. In other words, there's not going to be one single model that we simply replicate. I think this is close to attempting the most difficult and administratively burdensome thing that you can think of as the standard response for everything. And it'll be different in every case. So you can see, I think this is not terribly attractive. There must be something better than this. If we do this, then I at least prefer the HM Treasury approach. I think the HM Treasury paper is at least honest and open about some of the issues that we're going to have to address, some of the approximations, the compromises, the rough justice that may be required. The deep irony is that we're only doing this because we've got this highly complex view about value creation, and we're going to end up with completely blunt compromises, rough justice. That just seems to me completely odd. Maybe the solution is to take stock of where we are and what we're trying to do. I must say I'm much less convinced that this is about rewarding value creation or applying the existing rules than an effort or a wish to allocate profits to the state of the user, of the market or sales, i.e. the destination state. Or, as Mindy said, basically an upgrade of the system for the 21st century economy. Now, if that's right, let's come clean on the point. There are some much less complex routes, that might be followed, including, if you want it, combining elements of the current system with a destination. Combining elements of the current system with a destination approach. I wonder if they would be worth a look. Thank you.
Hi there. this feels like a kind of scary audience for an industry tax professional from tech. So I didn't produce any slides because I thought, when I looked at the lineup this morning, I thought it's going to be quite interesting hearing what they've all got to say. And I'm probably just going to want to change all of my slides over lunchtime anyway. So if you'll bear with me, what I've done is jotted down quite a few thoughts from what I've heard this morning. And I would like to make some comments from the point of view of a technology company. So a little bit about me and a little bit about the company. I am a chartered accountant. I am a group head of tax in a British outbound tech company. If you were to ask me what I did 20 years ago, I'd say I do tax. I sometimes lapse into accountancy when I see a really bad double entry bookkeeping entry, but that's about it. But these days, I would say I was a pretty decent techie. I'm a director of several cybersecurity companies, and I probably speak technology as often as I speak tax. Maybe I've been digitalised, or maybe I am just digital. My company's Sophos. Sophos is a 30-year-old startup. People keep telling me I work for a startup, and I say, yes, I do, but it has been here for 30 years. We're British outbound. We have around 4,000 staff across the globe, and we're a FTSE 250 listed company. What we basically do is keep the baddies off the internet. We will protect your phones, your laptops, all of these devices that you have. And you know, we have a pretty simple business model. We're a UK entrepreneur. We have contract R&D services around the globe. Most of our subs are limited risk distributors. So it really is a pretty simple business model. And basically, we're around there to stop hackers. But this is a really good position to be in, because to look after the internet, we need to know what the future looks like. We need to be doing R&D now to protect the internet of the future. We can't wait till it happens. Everyone's systems fall down and then we go, oops, we should have thought of something to fix that. So these proposals are quite interesting to me, because I look ahead and I think, okay, this is how we're planning to tax this, but does this really work? So today I want to talk a little bit about the digital economy. Can we ring fence it? And Michael did a bit of an economics 101. I might indulge in a little bit technology 101, if that's all right with everyone. And if I ask some questions, it might keep you awake after lunch. Maybe I should have just played cute cat videos, because of course that's exactly what the internet's all about. So in 2015, I was quite happy, because the OECD appeared to conclude that you couldn't ring fence the digital economy, and I have to say I agreed with that approach. I then become quite concerned when I see that in 2018 we're revisiting this, and the EU definitely looks like it's trying to ring fence the digital economy, and not that much time has passed. That is a bit concerning. And my feeling is a tax system must have longevity. It can't be unstable, or else it isn't fit for purpose. Now, does the whole world really look different 3 years on? That isn't longevity, and that's really a bit concerning. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is ring fencing the digital economy. Let's take something that we might say isn't tech. Let's talk about vacuuming my house. That sounds really exciting, doesn't it? So how does a techie approach vacuuming her house? Well, she first of all online goes and buys a robot vacuum cleaner. So then what I do is I leave for work because I have forgotten to set it off. So I press a button on my phone that says vacuum cleaner, go vacuum my house. Bam, off it goes. So while it's vacuuming and swallowing the odd sock, it's collecting data. So it's sending data to my phone to tell me how it's doing. It's sending data to its manufacturer. My husband might be logging my KPIs, so it might be sending data to him as well. And I think, I wonder if it's doing its job. So I log on to my webcam on my phone, and I watch my vacuum cleaner going around the house, and my webcam company is collecting data on my webcam usage. And I spot that the vacuum cleaner is providing massive entertainment for my cat. And I think that's really cute. So I start taking a video of the cat chasing the robot vacuum cleaner, and I put it up on YouTube, and it gets lots of likes. And then because I work for a cybersecurity company, they're saying, oh my gosh, she's putting stuff on YouTube. She's open to hackers. Let's start monitoring all her devices and making sure that the vacuum cleaner and the webcam and the phone are not being hacked, or they're not being used to harvest Bitcoin, or we haven't suddenly become vulnerable. So was hoovering my house digitized, or was it a traditional enterprise? I don't know. I don't believe there is anything that cannot be digitized. I would refer you all to a very good Twitter page, if you're on Twitter at the moment, called Daphne's Cat Flap. So Daphne is not my cat, but someone won an award for writing an algorithm for a Raspberry Pi. And every time Daphne walks in or out the cat flap, you either get a front end photo or a rear end photo, and it tweets it automatically with a very amusing comment about Daphne. Now, we don't even know who Daphne's algorithm writer was or not, but that just shows you can be contributing daily to social media, and it's a fiction, it's an algorithm that's doing this. It is not a person who is a user. Sorry, I digress to cats again. It's typical. And on the basis of anything can be digitized. Before I was coming here, I said to my staff, can you tell me anything that can't be digitized? A bunch of techies. And they sort of looked a bit puzzled, and I said, okay, tell me your best apps on your phone. What are we looking at digitizing? And one owned up that he had an app on his phone that measured how high in the air he could throw his phone, and he had paid for that. Another one told me that he had an app on his phone to tell him whether or not it was dark outside, and when I pointed out that we worked in glass offices, but the point is, absolutely every aspect of life can be digitalized, and there isn't a separate digital economy. And if you think there is today, come back in 2 years' time, 3 years' time. There won't be a separate digital economy. So if you are trying to define the scope of what is a digital business now, the only thing I can guarantee is that you're getting it wrong. It will not have longevity. I do, however, have a great deal of sympathy for revenue services trying to get their heads around what the tech industry actually is. And I think there are some issues that we have to think about. I do think it's possible to design a sensible tax system. I think that the OECD are probably the ones who should lead in this. I would like something new designed once. I'm not a fan of interim measures, and unilateral actions are so disruptive to our business. They're a distraction, and I don't feel that they benefit anyone. Premature action is just going to increase complexity, and we all survive because, frankly, our investors want us to survive. And investors have a choice. They can invest in highly digitized businesses, or they can move away from that to things that they understand. And I think we always have to consider the needs that we have to try to explain what we're doing to non-tax people, and the impact on non-tax people to keep investment in the EU and specifically in the UK. So we've had a lot of discussion about value creation. I hesitate to add to it because I can't follow Michael's football. I have not watched a single World Cup match. Thank you to Women in Tax for arranging the dinner last night. So we need to think about what is created but in value creation. Now we track hackers around the world, and people are not necessarily clicking to help us with that, but we manage their devices all around the world. The devices report back to us, a firewall that might be running a bit hot, server running a bit hot. We measure absolutely masses. We collect a ton of data. I don't know where the value is created. For some businesses, I'm sure it's fairly easy to demonstrate value, although I'm not quite so sure now. But certainly for many digital businesses, it's incredibly difficult to work out where the value is created. Part of what my business does is it sets traps in the internet. We pretend to be vulnerable old ladies because we want hackers to come after us so that we can find them. And the greatest piece of value created might, say, be in a country like Nigeria, where we're not set up and we don't sell. But maybe a hacker sprung a trap there and gave us an incredibly valuable piece of information that we can then roll out to the whole globe, and it raises the bar. It might raise us above our competition because we figured out how to do something. Whereas most of the data that comes in, there aren't that many ways to hack someone, so most of the data that comes in, I would say, is entirely valueless because it doesn't add to our knowledge. It probably adds to our stats, but not our knowledge. Here we get to the questions. I've seen many proposals that talk about the location of users and measuring clicks. And one of my feelings is that any tax system that's based on that has some issues. So can anyone in the room tell me, in fact you said you weren't going to move to a different geography, Michael, I might be able to prove that you already have. Can anyone tell me what IP stands for in IP address? I'll give you a hint, it's an abbreviation of TCP IP. Hands up anyone who can tell me what IP stands for. Bill, SWAT. It does. But I've got a room full of tax people and only Bill put his hand up. So this is a bit worrying because remember, we're designing a tax system around potentially finding users by their IP address. So that's a bit worrying. And to explain my worries about IP or numbers of users being a threshold, how do we know how many users we've got and how do we know where they are? Why does this worry me? So your IP address, if you imagine you don't jump onto the internet, you jump onto some sort of service provider, and it might be your router at home, your service provider at home, a cafe here. I'm sure lots of you are using the internet. And they then connect you to the internet. So they sit in the middle. This provider sits in the middle. And what your IP address does is say, hey, I want information on Daphne's cat flap, but I'm going to tell you where to send it back to. So that's what the IP address does. It tells the internet where to send back this information. So I don't want you to get attached to your IP address. I wouldn't tattoo it on your arm, because if you switch your router on and off and reset it, you might find that you've got a different IP address by the time you've done that. And every time you go into a cafe or you move or you connect one of your many devices to something else, your IP address can change. I was taking a quick look at my phone this morning. I think I've had between 6 and 8 different IP addresses already today. By the time I got my house, my car, coming in here, going and get my cup of coffee. And you then sort of start to think about, well, how easy is it to spoof an IP address, to pretend to be somewhere you're not? The answer is extremely easy, and we're probably all doing it all of the time, because you would quite legitimately do this with no criminal intent or no plan to fool the tax authorities. So why would you want to do that? Maybe for your own safety and security. You don't want someone to geographically track you. I looked at my phone this morning, sort of stalking my children, and noticed that my daughter was in her flat in Putney. That surprised me because I'd run her to the airport yesterday to go to Cuba. She'd spoofed her IP address for her own safety because she didn't want to be tracked in Cuba. But believe you me, she will be using her entire social network while she is there. But it's going to look like she's sitting in Putney. How many of you use VPNs, virtual private networks? So the statistics say that 1/4 of all internet users will use a VPN at some point or another. And why do we use a VPN? We use it for privacy, so that no one knows where we are. We might use it to increase our bandwidth because we want to stream videos and we don't want someone to slow us down, and because a VPN is encrypted, they can't tell what we're looking at. So we could use VPNs anywhere in the world. I'm using one now when I logged on in here because it's an insecure Wi-Fi. I could be logged on to our VPN in Silicon Valley, so I look like an American clicking. So we all use VPNs for absolutely legitimate reasons, and we should. We use proxy servers for legitimate reasons. we use Tor browsers, the dark web, maybe not for legitimate reasons. But any tax system that requires us to know where our users are is fundamentally flawed, because for absolutely legitimate reasons, we can't track them. And we don't want to track them. We probably shouldn't be tracking them. And I suppose the next thing, if establishing geography is difficult, establishing clicks, as I've said, I've probably had 6 or 8 different IP addresses this morning. So does that make me 1 user, or does that make me 8 users? So if our threshold is, 1 million users, 100 million users, am I 10 users every day because I've got different IP addresses, different devices, and I move around. So these are things that we really need to solve, and this is where my techie head comes in, because I see these proposals and I think that can't work. How is that going to work? It's all very well saying we will gloss over the detail, but the detail is critical. So the other thing is about the data, and I'm not going to go into evaluation of data. I'll just think about data collection. So we assume that users provide data, and they do. But so do robots. We have algorithms that crawl all over the internet, and these algorithms might be created in lots of locations, and they might live on lots of diffuse servers. They crawl all over the internet, and they'll have this language recognition ability, and they will gather data, and they will bring it back, and it will be stored, perhaps not in one place, perhaps in lots of places. Is that robot a user? Now, I remember Bill Gates saying we should tax robotics, and everyone laughed. But what we're doing now is we're using robotics to create a lot of value. We're using AI, we're using deep learning. I haven't heard any mention of that, in any of these proposals, but it's here now. We use deep learning on a daily basis. In the cybersecurity industry, the worst thing you can have is an antivirus that keeps blocking things. It's an absolute nightmare because it can block lots of legitimate things. So you use deep learning to stop false positives. You want it to learn about you, what your normal web traffic is, the type of things you look at. And it gets to know you, and it gets to know your system, and it improves. That is a robot creating value, maybe. I hesitate to say. You've terrified me with value creation now. So where are we? I think we've got to get back to the principle that the heart of the matter is who has taxing rights and how are they divided. We can get very caught up in other bits of the debate, but are we taxing profits or are we actually taxing transactions? I think we have to make our minds up about that, and I think hybrid or go in with one and then switch to the other, that's really difficult message for business. We want one solution. We want to take the time to get there properly. We don't want unilateral action. We want as wide an uptake as is absolutely possible so that we have consistency. The UK is an absolutely fantastic place to do tech, but I hesitate to say it. The US is better and they're ahead of us. In the US, you can raise finance if you're a tech company. You have a wealth of talent. If you're a techie, your profession is highly regarded. You're not a bit weird. Believe me, in the UK, the techies are thought of a bit odd, and they sit over there and eat pizza and wear hoodies, look at cats. But in the US, you're highly respected. So you've got an environment that fosters tech. And we've got to be really careful here that we're not damaging the EU and the UK, particularly in the Brexit environment. And as a head of tax, I absolutely get it that scale without economic presence looks like an issue. High reliance on IP looks like an issue. And those are things that the traditional tax system, perhaps just doesn't address. I think that there are flaws in the tax system, and I do think we need something. But going on to the EU interim measure, the tax on transactions, the interim measure feels like a crude sledgehammer approach to us. It's very difficult to go into an interim measure when there is no articulation about what the long-term solution looks like or when we get to it. And I think it was possibly Heather that mentioned this morning about VAT being an interim measure at one point. And this is a concern to us, that we could end up with is it a Sutton tax, Michael? Yeah, a Sutton, I like that one. Sutton tax that could be with us for a very long time. And the other thing that worries me about the EU interim measure is I don't know if my company's going to be hit. I have read it, I have taken advice on it, I've looked at it from every angle, and if I analyse my business, there are aspects of my business that I think, that could be caught, but I don't know. And that's a kind of worrying place for heads of tax and tech companies to be, because I don't think we were an intended target, but I can see aspects of our business that might give some revenue authorities an opportunity to just open a conversation, which then takes up time and resource. As far as the significant digital presence, the digital PE long-term solution, I'm not concerned that my company will be caught by that. I know my company will be caught by that because everything is caught by that if you look at the appendices to that. And again, it's time, it's resource, it's looking at the EU, thinking really, we have choices. We have staff all over the world. Do you want to just move some further in this direction and get away from this? Do you want to re-emphasise the target geographies that you're working in? They're all conversations that happen because the boards of all of our companies are international boards. They're people who will challenge our location and talk about where we do business. So where does that take us? The one thing I would think about, which is almost putting the end before the beginning, is saying, what have we taken to manage controversy? What views are we taking? No matter what we implement here, there is going to be a lot of uncertainty and there is going to be a lot of debate with revenue authorities. Now, I don't know how many of you have experience of the competent authority process. I've been trying to get two competent authorities into the same room now for nearly 3 years. And, between illnesses and, people changing jobs and all of the same, it feels to me like that process is broken and very much under-resourced. So if we're going to move forward with any of these measures, maybe the first thing we have to think about is dispute resolution. How is that going to work? And are revenue authorities resourced for this? Because, believe me, there are going to be disputes. And as you said, disputes between states, disputes between taxpayers and revenue authorities. It will take years to bed down. And then by the time we're potentially bedding down an interim measure, are we moving on to something else? I'm cynical about the interim measure ever being replaced, because if you're a winner with the interim measure, if your nation wins on this, why are you ever going to agree to let it go? The losers will lobby for something else, but it's very difficult to get rid of something that is working well for some countries. And the view of the investors in the business, tech can be a very difficult proposition for investors. They don't often understand it, and if you're not one of the tech giants, they're immediately suspicious. And it's one of the issues we have with raising finance in the UK for tech and across Europe. So tech companies often go to great lengths to be able to forecast out 3 to 5 years and to really explain their business and where they're going, because investors are very suspicious that we can pivot so quickly to different things. So how do you explain a completely new tax system that's potentially coming in 18 months and you're not entirely sure if you're going to be impacted or not? That has a big impact on investor faith. And these investors have a choice. It's going to be very easy to just go and invest in something nice and safe in the States that they understand. And we want to keep our European investor community engaged. So waffled on about tech for long enough. My view is no interim measures, please. We're quite happy to be taxed on profits, preferably once. We could live with a transaction tax, but take your time and really think about it, not a 3% sledgehammer that we haven't really done a full impact analysis of yet. And I hope I've demonstrated that we can't ring-fence the digital economy, and that everyone, including me, has probably now been digitalised.
Thanks very much. I'm really actually not sure there's anything left to be said at this point. Normally going last is relatively safe because you get to make a couple of interesting points that everybody else has forgotten to make, but not with this three. In fact, the one very important thing I did learn, which I hadn't known before, is that Mike Devereux is, as I had suspected, a secret Daily Telegraph reader. But so I'm going to run through this quite quickly because I think actually it would be interesting to get questions on this. And out of perhaps a sense of mercy, I'm not going to talk about either the interim proposal or the long-term proposal. I think plenty has been said on those already. I want to just draw this back slightly to the context we find ourselves in, and both as somebody who worked for a business for a very long time and now as an advisor, I'm very aware of the context in which we operate, and we can make theoretical arguments about the way things should be. We can complain about the things which have been proposed, but in the end, in the words of the old cliche, we are where we are, and that's where we have to try and move forward from. And that may not be pleasant, but, well, that's where we are. So just a couple of very preliminary comments. The first is, as was said this morning, there is a BEPS context to this and a non-BEPS context to this. And I think there's a lot of intellectual confusion in almost everything that's swirling around on this. And that, in the end, is because this is about politics, not really about tax policy, at least as an initial matter. And we need to understand that because that's where we are. There are elements of this that are BEPS, although I do really think that it is too soon to tell how effective BEPS has been. I think it is going to need more time with some of the things which relate to tax havens, to some of the anti-hybrid moves, and as was said this morning, also, in fact, to US tax reform. There have been a number of really very significant moves in the past 3, 4, 5 years which have changed the way that people structure themselves. Putting aside what Ali was saying about how businesses have changed, actually the way that people approach tax planning and the way they approach their structures has changed dramatically. And whether that's anti-hybrid stuff which came out of BEPS or whether it's what's in the new US proposals, there is just a lot which has changed. So I think we need to bear that in mind. That said, there is a huge sort of non-BEPS part to this, which is the world is changing very, very dramatically. And business models are changing in ways that certainly we as tax people cannot even begin to comprehend. And that's tax people in governments, it's tax people in businesses, it's advisors, it's even academics. It is very hard to get our mind around something which is dramatically changing in the way that it is. But we are stuck with this narrative, this political narrative, which seems to be largely hooked on BEPS, and we have, I think, to try and work our way at least around that, if not completely out from it. There are a couple of other elements of this intellectual confusion that I was talking about, and again, some of these have been teased out today. There is a real confusion, I think, between sales and profits. Now, in the end, maybe fundamentally, there isn't a great deal of difference between those, but certainly the way that they are taxed, as we currently understand it, in the international context, there are huge differences between that. So obviously, a transaction, as the name implies, is a single thing which happens. Generally, you know when it happens. Quite often, you know where it happens. Although I would again point you to Ali's IP example, Internet Protocol example, that actually you can't always tell where things happen. But with a transaction, that's relatively straightforward. With profit, it is something very different. You are essentially talking about, you call it what you want, the system profit, the return above operating expenses, whatever it is, of a whole corporation. And you can split that up into entities. You can use various methods, as we have to in transfer pricing and various things, to split that up. But you're essentially talking about the profit of an enterprise and how you split that up. And that is something which is very different from transactions. And yet, at the moment, we are confusing dramatically transaction taxes with profits taxes. We'll fess up from the direct tax side. Transfer pricing is part of the problem here, because transfer pricing essentially looks at things transactionally, and we then try and determine profits on top of that. So, as I say, there's intellectual confusion, quite a lot of which has been existing for a while. Another thing which I think is a problem, and which we need to draw back from, is that the debate at the moment is being driven by a dramatically small slice of one business model around social media. And I'm not going to go back to what Mindy said, although I do think that there is a competitive element, shall we say, in what's going on with taxation. But the fact that we are focused laser-like in these proposals on social media, I think is a mistake. Not because you don't want to tax certain types of value-creating activities. Of course you do, and I think we all accept that. But if you drive tax policy based on a very small subset of things, which could dramatically change in relation to taxes, as Mike said, if you sort of push somewhere, push down on something, something else is going to come up somewhere else. So if you push down on a certain type of model, who knows? It'll switch to subscription basis. It'll switch to something else. So, this focus on just this thing, I think, is leading us down a false trail. And again, I think we need to be very careful about that. With user participation, again, this may be an element in some business models. But is it an element in everything? Firstly, there's a huge spectrum of user participation, which stretches from something which is highly digitalized in social media over here to something which is very traditional over here, whether it's market research, whether it's, so I was saying to somebody at lunch, sort of pulling young people in from the street and offering them, £10, which of course they don't declare, and which you may not declare either, to sort of look at a movie and say, well, what do you think about this? So, there's always going to be something relatively iterative in the production of goods and probably services because, hey, you're actually trying to sell them. You are trying to sell people what they want. Unless you have a command economy which tells people what they want, and over the past 100 years those haven't worked out so well. Actually, you're trying to find out what people want. So there is this give and take in almost every type of production activity. So again, I think we need to think about that. I was going to talk about the value of data, but I think that Ali really has talked about that. Data again is not a super factor. The problem that we face in this area is not really understanding it terribly well, and yet instinctively feeling, certainly at a political level, that something needs to be done. We sort of reach out for the few things that we can understand and see and touch. And that may be data. It may be the idea that, we're interacting, because most of us, from time to time at least go onto Facebook and you post something and something comes back and you say, oh yeah, I can just about get that conceptually. But looking out there, it's so much larger than that, and we just don't do it. So, I think we need to think about what it is that we're trying to do. Mike talks about this much more eloquently than I do. Maybe we do need to go back and look at, what profit is, and is profit the basis on which we should be taxing? I think we need to be clear that if we have a digital tax which is focused on profit, then we need to understand what profit is, and profit is not the same as transaction. But equally, profit is a relatively malleable concept itself. People play around with profits. That in part is what the CCCTB is about. But it's also about what countries do when they introduce things like bonus depreciation, faster amortization. They're playing around with the tax base to try to increase, even on a cash flow basis, the resources that companies have. So, again, all of these things, we need to bear in mind what it is that we're trying to do and what it is that we're truly trying to tax. I do think that we need to have an incredibly serious and detailed conversation about this because things really are changing and tax bases are changing and governments have legitimate interests in raising the money that they need to spend, that their citizens expect them to spend, in order to fund the services that they want. Governments need to do that, and we understand that. And for economic reasons, but really for political reasons, it is still going to be necessary to tax businesses. Okay? So how do we do that sensibly? I think that's part of what we need to talk about. But at the same time, this digital issue is so much broader than those narrow things that I was talking about before. So just to take two things, digital supply chains and virtual teams. Those of you who work in businesses will know all about these. How do we think about profit in that context? How do we think about taxing those things? Again, I think we need to do that. But at the same time, when we're having this conversation, we mustn't lose hold of those things which have traditionally been important in terms of value creation. I'll come to the term value creation in a second. But, it's true when we talk about moving to, and I think the next panel will do this, when you talk about moving to destination-based taxation or market-based taxation, sure, you could not raise any money if you did not sell the stuff that you're making or providing. Okay, I get that. But equally, you will have a really hard job starting a business if you have no capital. You will also have a really difficult time selling things, particularly in this increasingly digital context, if you don't have innovative products. So there should be a return to the innovative product as well. legal protection. Again, we can talk about this in terms of, well, here's what this country provides, here's what this country provides. That's generally going to be pushed by the home country over other countries. So there are these traditional factors that we also need to bear in mind. And therefore, I think I think we need to have this conversation. Now, this is the point at which they say, business always says that. All you're trying to do is to spin this out. Well, let me make very clear, and I've made it clear before, but I'll make it clear again now. Business, at least as it's represented at the OECD through BIAC, has been crystal clear that this is a real issue and that it needs to be solved in a realistic period of time, and that the time which has been set out in the OECD interim report of 18 months to 2 years is appropriate. The only way, however, they're going to make that work is if people like Ali in particular are involved in that conversation, and the tech people, so that governments understand where these models, how these models are developing, where it's going to go. But this cannot be something which is thought about not just in an ivory tower, but in a government office or even in a tax office. It needs everybody to be involved in this. So I do agree that something needs to be done, but the something which needs to be done is not an interim tax now, and it's probably not a significant digital presence tax, but it is a really serious conversation which tries to get to grips with these fundamental issues. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. There's one to start us off. Let's take 2 or 3 questions first. Maybe you, sir, at the back, could start us off.
Thank you. Robert Palmer from Tax Justice UK. You've all done a very good job of explaining the problems with the various proposals that governments have put forward. I'd love to hear your elevator pitch, if you had a Minister of Finance in the elevator for 30 seconds, on what you think governments should be doing when it comes to taxing digital companies or taxing multinational companies in general.
Okay. And person immediately in front of you, and then perhaps we can come to you.
Hello, Peter Lewinsky, Oxford, a student here at Law and Finance. I have a very technical economic question. So when businesses, they now optimize around profits and EBITDA to pay their taxes, if we change it to the user base, do you think they are going to optimize around the definition of the user, but also like how many users they have, etc., and maybe this could lead to like social, for example, lack of social inclusion in the services, because they would be saying like, oh, I'm not going to onboard you into Netflix or Facebook because your lifetime customer value is lower than what I'm going to get in the taxes. So now the question is, now businesses are optimizing around tax and around profits and EBITDA and all the accounting measures. In the future, they could be optimizing around different measures like user base. How does this change the incentives of the stakeholders? Thank you.
Okay, and a third question just here, please. Ali, are you happy to take the first go at that second question?
Thank you very much. My question is for the whole panel, but particularly perhaps Ali Kennedy. Given the data near monopoly of a few large tech firms, it's a now well understood phenomena that startups that lack access to data, especially in emerging markets, there can be the network effect keeps getting accentuated, and that prevents new tech startups to come up, from coming up, thriving, investing in R&D, innovating in new spaces. If tax, in your view, is not the way to sort of level the playing field for startups, what kind of measures do you think governments should be thinking about in terms of not only addressing populist concerns about wealth redistribution, but also government concerns and popular concerns about fostering a genuinely level playing field for smaller tech startups which don't have the access to capital data that the large ones do?
Okay, can I suggest Mike and Will, you take the first question, if you would, your elevator pitch, and then Ali, if you don't mind taking the next 2 questions, I think you've got your name on.
Do you go first?
Sure. So there is there's that old Woodrow Wilson quote about, if you want a 5-hour speech, I can start now, but if you want a 30-second one, you'll have to wait a week. So this will be maybe slightly longer than the average elevator speech, but it's a really fair question, and I do think, as I said towards the end that there are some really significant issues here for countries, and legitimate ones about the changing shapes of tax bases. And I didn't get to one of the things I forgot to say towards the end was, if you look, for example, and Ali mentioned artificial intelligence. I mean, we're moving into a phase where actually we don't even have the tax language to describe what it is that's happening. I mean, value creation stops working when you launch what the heck does it mean to launch a bot into a sea of data? I mean, we're using sort of human terms that we try and understand, but it's something quite different. So, I do think things are changing. Equally, I understand that as tax bases change shape, and one of the other examples I sometimes give is if you look at the US and you look at autonomous vehicles, there are 3 million people involved in transportation in one form or another in the US. If you assume a move to autonomous vehicles, so all 3 million of those people lose their job, I mean, you have a huge problem, a huge issue anyway, and probably a problem. And it's not just a corporate income tax problem, it's an income tax problem, it's a social taxes problem, it's all of those things. So we do need to look at that. But at the same time, because it's changing, and because there is a danger, which we haven't really talked about, of massive unilateralism, I do think the conversation has to take place at the OECD. But I also, I do, as I said, and I really mean, this is a conversation which has to take place in a relatively concentrated period of time. Otherwise, that unilateralism will happen. But if we don't aim for some type of multilateral consensus on how we tax in a digitalizing economy, then we're going to be in a real mess. So that is not, it was a pretty long elevator. But I think we need to have that conversation. And I do worry that the interim solution will trump everything else, because it probably won't work on the EU level as such. But if individual countries do it, it takes just enough pressure off. Then maybe you don't have that sustained conversation. Sorry,
Okay.
a bit lengthy.
Can I go as well?
Yeah, you're going
okay.
one floor.
So, so that was the Empire State Building. So I'll give you a quicker version, maybe. But I agree with some of that. I think what I was trying to say, I do have an answer. It's a destination-based cash flow tax. Yes. For those of you who haven't heard of it already, then you should come and ask me later or read some of the papers that we have on it. But the basic idea is what I was trying to get at in my talk, which is, we need to tax something which is immobile, and the things which would typically be immobile are consumers. Actually, before Ali was speaking, I had thought that we could actually think about taxing where users are, but actually I'm now not so sure. In fact, I'm convinced we probably can't. Actually, the destination-based tax doesn't try to do that, but other things where we've tried to think about kind of basing tax on destination or immobile things, that they may do, and that's kind of complications for that, like taxes on allocating residual profits to where users are and so on. Seems to be complicated. So I'm afraid that the answer is still the destination-based cash flow tax.
Always. Ali, do you mind having a go at those other two questions?
Okay. I'm just going to state that I do not work for one of the tech giants, and can't necessarily speak from their perspective, but I believe the first question there was, tech companies, will they move away from optimizing on profits to optimizing on some other metric? And I think what I would say to you is that they already have. Tech companies can be a bit of a new world in that they often are full of millennials who don't necessarily see making large profits as a legitimate motive to operate, and I think that's wonderful. And last night I was reflecting on one of my absolutely favourite tech companies, who was founded by a friend of mine called Parkrun. I don't know if any of you are aware of Parkrun. And Parkrun does measure users and user locations, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, they organise free 5k runs in the park for anyone who wants them every Saturday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, and I'm a run director at founding one. But it's now gone global. It's in Russia, it's in South Africa, it's all over the world, and it's a tech company. I know that what you see is the user turning up, but what it does is it basically attracts you with a lot of metrics because you want to be 1 second faster than you were the week before, or you want to still be capable of beating your daughter. Sorry, I'm maybe giving away something. But tech companies like that, are already not thinking about profit, and I think that's incredibly helpful. Where some of them just want to do some good in the world, and they measure the success around participation and users. There will always be, many that do care about profit, but I think we are definitely in a world here where we have to be completely open-minded about that and accept that the generation of techies now will have different measures of success. It might be slightly tough if you're sitting in a FTSE or in an index where you're looking at earnings per share, but lots of my absolute favourite tech companies out there couldn't care less about earnings per share. They're just out there to do some good. Don't know if that answered it. The other question on startups and data monopoly. I mean, I have never worked in a tech startup, but I interact with tech startups frequently because we're quite acquisitive, and a lot of startups actually start up with the objective of selling to a giant or selling to a multinational. And others want to be out there to change the world, to create something amazing and something good. And one of the trends I like at the moment is there is a trend towards making more data open and having more open source code, which I believe helps startups. But I think the thing that tax authorities that can do that is amazing is the R&D regime. UK have a great R&D regime. It's the envy of a lot of other territories. It's a great way. It won't level the playing field. We can't pretend that you're going to level the playing field between eBay and a new marketplace startup. But at least it gets these companies going. And I also think we have to look at our grassroots education, because the other thing that Britain needs to have is this great base of educated techies, of people who come out of schools tech savvy and they can code. So I think rather than doing odd things with the tax system, I would like to see us supporting R&D expense credits, which I still claim are a grant, not part of the tax system. Going back to grassroots and making sure that we are actually a great place to have a tech company, because we have talent, we have infrastructure, and we have support. And I don't think anything that you do with corporation tax or with a transaction tax is going to level that playing field. I think the most important thing is that the UK, the EU, is a really attractive location that can rival the US.
I think we can take two further quick questions before we close. I haven't been looking, so please.
Hi, Kunal Nathwani from Evershed Sutherland. My question's more in relation to other taxes that exist in the tax system. So at the moment we seem to be looking a lot at the corporation tax regime, but take for example a traditional bricks and mortar type of business. When they acquired properties in order to sell things, there was other taxes that applied as well. So things like stamp duty, land tax, and all these other things which added to the tax bill. A lot of new tech companies can sort of avoid that tax bill to a large extent in comparison to these other more traditional businesses that exist. So how does one sort of level the playing field between all this and deal with that sort of inequity that exists between the traditional model and the new model, which I'm not sure is being addressed at the moment in relation to a lot of the proposals?
Okay, do we have one last question? Richard. Richard.
Richard Tether, Bournemouth University. We've sort of circled around the idea that governments are saying that they want to tax companies where the value is created, but they're actually moving towards taxing them where the customer is located. Is the problem that this is really similar to the Occupy movement and so on, the protests that compared the amount of corporate tax paid in the country with the amount of turnover, with the amount of sales in that country? It's really trying to deal with that, to deal with that tax objection. But the problem is we've got a political movement that wants to tax companies where their customer is, but also loathes VAT, which is the one tax that actually does tax businesses where the customers are based. So is the problem that we're seeing with these corporate tax reforms and the new proposals really because they're trying to square that circle of trying to apply corporation tax in a way that it just isn't designed to do, rather than switching over to the tax that does solve the problem, but is going to create a whole new set of political objections?
Okay, well, thank you for both those questions. A similar sort of theme. Can I just get closing comments from each of the three of you on those in response? Mike, you go first. We just walked down.
Yeah, so I mean, other taxes, that's important, and we need to think about them. I mean, the effects of those are quite complicated to figure out. There's something like, a stamp duty land tax. In order to kind of figure out whether that kind of interferes with competition between digital and non-digital businesses, you have to kind of understand, what it actually does to the prices and costs of that business and the extent to which it's kind of passed on to owners of the property rather than kind of anybody who's leasing it. But I mean, there are certainly, there are other distortions caused by the tax system. Whether the answer to that is to say, let's have another tax, which we think we hope might kind of offset a little bit the tax, some other distortion. I'm not sure that's the right way forward. I think we should again take the kind of the whole view and say, okay, well, if there's a problem in this bit, let's address that rather than kind of add on another bit somewhere else. I think Richard's point about consumers and customers and corporation tax. I think it's certainly true that there was a kind of point in time where people were saying, well, they're making all these sales here and we're not taxing them. I think it would be also true that if a lot of companies here which were producing here and exporting and we weren't taxing them, then that would also cause an outcry. So I guess in my view, we need to take a whole view on that and actually possibly educate people as to kind of what a sensible tax system would be, rather than to kind of just cope with kind of whatever is the kind of political statement of the day.
Ali and Will, do you have any comments?
So on the point of rate stamp duty, I don't have data on the comparison between a bricks and mortar business and a tech business. One thing I can say is, I can dispel the myth that tech companies don't pay these costs. We do have buildings, we do have people in them. They might not be on the high street, but the one thing about tech companies is, we like our premises and we like our toys, and we are still buying and working out of probably some of the most modern, dynamic and funky businesses in the globe. We certainly have massive premises. I have no idea why, but there are constant complaints about business rates and premises, and it would be interesting to do the comparison. I think you would tend to find that the technology companies, although it's different kind of bricks and mortar, it's not on the high street, we're still very office-based focused, and still subject to a lot of those issues. VAT, I think the issue is that we're not moving away from it. I think the issue is that some of these users aren't charged for service. So if you are selling an end-user license agreement or something like that, yes, you're absolutely accounting for sales tax in a traditional way. But what if you're looking at taxing the user? You're not selling them anything. They're not going to pay VAT, so it doesn't feel like that's going to be the answer.
I have nothing to say on bricks and mortar taxes at all. Nothing useful anyway. On customers and VAT, you heard me talk before about the confusion between transaction taxes and profits taxes. I think the issue is, and certainly the political issue is, that there are, it's not just a perception, it is reality. There are super profits being made in some areas of the digitalised economy. And there is a political concern that those profits are going untaxed. And a VAT won't solve that problem.
I'd like to thank my panel very much indeed, Will, Ali and Mike, and that's the end of this panel. On to the next session. Thank you.